very pleased to introduce our program and panel as a part of LBI's year-long exploration of 1,700 years of German Jewish history. This is based on the fact that in 321, Emperor Constantine issued an edict that said the Jews of Cologne can hold public office. We've taken that fact and built a project around that I hope you'll check out. One of our staff will put the link in the chat. But basically, we've chosen 58 objects to span the 1,700 years. There are essays about the objects, and there are themes that we tell throughout the year about migration, everyday life, inclusion, exclusion, acculturation, achievement, persecution, exile, and resilience. We are, we're about 40% through our project of the year, and at the end of the era of absolutism, 1648 to 1806. We've gathered 3 scholars, colleagues, who will discuss how the intellectual and social developments of this age impacted Jews and how Jews were a part of those developments. I don't want to take away from what they have prepared, but I will point out to you our project, as I said, and hope that you'll check it out and sign up for weekly updates. So if you allow me, I will introduce first our moderator, Elisheva Carlebach, who is the Sala Whitmire Baron Professor of Jewish History, Culture, and Society. She specializes in the cultural, intellectual, and religious history of the Jews of modern Europe. Areas of particular interest include the intersection of Jewish and Christian culture and its effect on notions of tolerance, religious dissent, conversion, messianism, and communal governance. Her task will be to moderate between our 2 other speakers, presenters. Michah Gottlieb is an associate professor of Hebrew and Judaic studies at New York University. His main field of research is modern Jewish thought and philosophy. He has interests that include the faith-reason debate and its political ramifications, modern Bible translation and interpretation, ethical education and character development, and bourgeois piety. Last but not least is David Sorkin, professor of modern Jewish history at Yale University, and for a long time, until recently, the chair of LBI's Academic Advisory Board. David's work is situated at the intersection of Jewish history and European history since the 16th century. I know that these 3 individuals, I've worked with them, and you're in for a treat. I now turn it over to Elisheva.
Thank you so much, Billy, and welcome everybody to this panel, which has me just as excited as you are. I hope this will turn out to be a really fruitful discussion about developments in early modern German lands that gave rise to a new chapter in Western Ashkenazic Jewish life and have left their imprint on Jewish history until this day. So this will be a kind of conversation, and I'd like to open in the middle of the 17th century. You have Europe at the midpoint of bloody wars between Protestants and Catholics. Europeans were just sick of fighting and bloodshed. And finally, the spent European powers come to an agreement to put down their arms and issue this Peace of Westphalia in 1648. That moment we've taken as a kind of turning point because it signals a shift in both German history as well as Jewish history. So I'd like to begin by asking David Sorkin, and I'm going to be using informal address, which does not imply the least diminution of my own respect for these 2 wonderful scholars. David, could you explain why the Peace of Westphalia was such a foundational moment, both in German political history, but also in German Jewish history?
Sure, Elisheva, thank you very much for that introduction. I think the Peace of Westphalia should be seen in terms of European and German history as a turning point in 2 respects. The first is that the Peace of Westphalia marked the advent of what we might call the age of toleration. The bloody wars of religion that the Reformation initiated were now at an end, had come to a stalemate, and the Peace of Westphalia, for the first time, recognized the legitimacy of three religions: Catholicism, Lutheranism, and Calvinism. It made provisions for Protestants to live in Catholic states, for Catholics to live in Protestant states, and for dissenting Protestants to live in Protestant states. Now, toleration, I should emphasize, does not mean equality. Toleration meant legislated or practiced inferiority. But what the Peace of Westphalia did do was recognize the necessity of finding ways for adherents of different religions to live together, even reluctantly. And of course, we could see the beginnings of this toleration as being an impetus for the Enlightenment. We can see the Enlightenment as the search for a common foundation of a multi-confessional or a multi-religious society, trying to find a shared morality. So that's one respect in which the Peace of Westphalia was so important. The second is in the German states in particular, in that the catastrophic loss of life and general devastation. Some historians estimate that 25 to 30% of the population of the German states died during those wars, meant that the German states had to undergo a major reconstruction to rebuild their economies and to rebuild their populations. So that meant that the states and their rulers were also interested in inviting in new sources of population, colonists, which could include Jews. And the states themselves entered a new period of what's called absolutist rule, in which the rulers increased their power by introducing new kinds of bureaucracies and standing armies. Also keep in mind that we have to speak here of the German states. We're not talking about Germany. There were some 300 or more polities in Central Europe. Now, the Peace of Westphalia was also then of cardinal importance for Jews in the German states. In fact, one can date the modern history of Jews in Germany from 1648. This notion of toleration of fellow Christians spilled over to the Jews in some respect. Once a polity contained multiple adherents of multiple forms of Christianity, it was possible to imagine including Jews as well, though of course in an inferior position. The need of states to rebuild their populations and economies also meant that the states saw Jews as potential colonists who could bring new population, but also new forms of trade and commerce that would be beneficial. Finally, the states themselves, these over 300 polities, needed help with finances and particularly help with maintaining their armies. And it's this period that the so-called court Jew emerges, the Jew who served as an army contractor, as a state banker, and in general served the state. Because there was a nucleus of new communities, because they brought with them a whole retinue of bookkeepers and business associates, a kosher slaughterer, tutors for their children, servants, etc. So, for example, one object in the exhibit are Moses Mendelssohn's spectacles. Moses Mendelssohn grew up in Dessau, which was a new community, numbered about 1,000 people at the end of the 18th century. but it had been founded by a court Jew.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, David, for that real panorama of this turning point. And now I know what to leave the Leo Baeck Institute, not my archive, but my spectacles, which were one of the important artifacts. So I want to turn now to Michah and ask, how did this new era of peace and toleration that David described, that extended not just between Christian denominations, but to Jews as well, again, with varying effects depending on where they were. How does this affect the place of Jews, not just within the new politics, but within Jews' self-perception? What did being Jewish mean? And how did that begin to change as Jews are occupying new positions and have new status in this period?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And it's great to be on this panel today. So let me speak a little to those issues. So first, with the greater peace between Christian denominations, right, German Jews now had new opportunities to interact with Christians, not just in the economic sphere, but also socially and culturally. And this kind of began to open what Jacob Katz called a semi-neutral society, in which Jews could now encounter Christians, if not as equals, at least as fellow human beings to some extent. And in German cities like Berlin and Hamburg, we find Jews who are flocking to coffee houses, fairs, enjoying literature, theater, and seeking out scientific knowledge. And we have a few Jews beginning to attend university, very often for medical studies. So what were the result of these new interactions and these new experiences? Well, the consequence was that for some German Jews, this meant a kind of drifting away from Jewish tradition, which they saw as narrow and limited. But for others, this impetus led them to seek to reconcile their new intellectual, cultural, and social horizons with Judaism. And to do that, they looked backwards, right? They looked at when they looked at contemporary Judaism, they very often saw Judaism that was suspicious of external influences, of Christian influences. They saw a Judaism that was very focused on, especially for males, on Talmud study. And they felt that many of these, of what was being taught was antagonistic to reason. So they began to look to Jewish models that they regarded as more open-minded. And these traditions, especially that they looked to, were the medieval Sephardim and the Italian communities. So the Jews who opened to these new experiences became known as maskilim. And there were different kind of stages of this. The best known is, of course, Moses Mendelssohn, but it began much earlier in what has been called the early maskilim. So this greater interaction with the Christian world combined with what David had mentioned, right? They could kind of see on the horizon the possibility of greater civil rights. Perhaps they even could dream at some point of citizenship, right? Eventually led many of these maskilim to enact reforms in the traditional Ashkenazic pattern of Jewish life. And really these reforms often centered on education. So the maskilim opened modern Jewish schools that taught secular studies along Jewish texts, that taught in German rather than Yiddish, that emphasized universal ethics as the core of Jewish practice, right? And David had mentioned this, how this concern with toleration leads to this kind of increased concern with universal ethics. They stressed rational understanding rather than blind obedience or fear as the basis of service of God. And they also inculcated the need for Jews to display patriotic and to feel patriotic loyalty to the state. Right, so I mentioned that previously the Talmud had been the center of the Jewish curriculum for Jewish males, but the Maskilim made the Bible, studied grammatically, central. And Moses Mendelssohn's translation of the Bible, which was known as the Beur and appeared from 1780 to 1783, was the first translation of the Bible into High German and became a centerpiece of this new curriculum. Towards the end of the period we're looking at, the end of the 18th century and into the beginning of the 19th century, the Maskilim also began to set up schools that for the first time gave girls a formal secular and Jewish education. And the Maskilim also sought to introduce socio-cultural changes into the Jewish community. For example, they stressed the importance of politeness and good manners in everyday interactions with both Jews and Gentiles, things that they thought were neglected in the traditional Ashkenazi community, and also the wearing of modern clothes, modern dress. In the realm of marriage and courtship, they introduced important changes, making love and personal preference the basis of marriage rather than parental arrangement. But I think it's important to say that in this period that we're discussing, and for the majority of this period, these changes did not affect the majority of German Jews. It was really the province of a small number of urban Jews. Most German Jews remained firmly within the sphere of what Jacob Katz called tradition-bound Judaism. But the reason why this is obviously so important is that because by the late 18th century, it was clear that the Maskilim had the wind at their back and that the old patterns of Jewish life were in severe decline.
Okay, I'm unmuted, sorry. Thank you for that, Michah. I suspect that your very, very interesting comments about the growing acculturation of German Jews across the religious spectrum into Western, or more specifically German life, is going to raise a number of questions in our audience. So I want to encourage people, if you have questions, to please note them in the Q&A function that's on the bottom of your screen, not the chat function. And we'll be moderating them, and we'll take some of these questions at the end if we have time. So audience, please take note of that. So that's a fascinating picture that you just laid out for us, really summarizing a library of books in several minutes worth of discussion. We're talking about growing linguistic acculturation, educational acculturation, integration into professions. I want to note my respected colleague Marion Kaplan's work on the somewhat different pace and trajectory of German Jewish women, which you mentioned, but I think it's important to keep the fact that the gender divide really does play a role in the different ways that Jews acculturate to German life. So as they're becoming more integrated and there's a growing sense of belonging to German society, Jews become more and more frustrated by their lack of equal legal standing in German law. And I want to turn back now to David Sorkin and ask, German Jews have this kind of dizzying patchwork arrangement of privileges. And one of the things I've learned, and we can all learn from your book, Emancipation, which is so rich, is that a privilege is not the same thing as a right. So could you talk a little bit about the distinction between those two concepts and why it was so important to Jews that they fight for equal civil rights or for emancipation? Why weren't they just content to be accepted as they were?
Yes, Elisheva, I think that's an excellent question, and I can't emphasize too strongly that distinction between privileges and rights. I think what we have to keep in mind is the character of the states or polities that readmitted Jews after 1648. In those states, there was no single uniform law that applied to everyone. Those states were organized by what's called estates or corporations, in which each different group had its own privileges granted in charters. It's much like medieval society, in which there was one set of privileges for the nobility, another set of privileges for the clergy, yet another separate set of privileges for the town burghers. Rulers treated Jews as a separate group and granted them privileges of their own, such as the privilege of residence, of residing in the state, of conducting certain businesses, of purchasing real estate, and also the privilege of religious observance or of building a synagogue. And of course, the rulers granted these privileges to Jews in exchange for various forms of revenue, flat annual fees, tariffs on trade. And in the German states in the 17th and 18th century, most of these privileges were actually granted to individual Jews, such as the court Jews, or there's an artifact in the exhibit number 18, the letter of protection in Speyer given to one Feist Hertz. Now, at the same time that the rulers were still granting privileges, they were also trying to get rid of the estates and the system of privileges in order to rule directly over all of their subjects and impose one uniform law for the convenience of ruling everyone in the same way. Now, what happened in the course, particularly of the 18th century, is the states began to replace those letters of privilege to individuals with actual Jewry laws, Judenordnungen, laws issued by the state for its Jews. And by the last third of the 18th century, from about 1770 onwards, the question arose, if the states imposed uniform law, creating equal subjects, could the Jews be included in that? Could the Jews be equal subjects and function in that way? And in the next decade, in the 1780s, one begins to find evidence of legislation and public debate moving in that direction. For example, Joseph II in the Habsburg Empire first issued edicts of toleration for Protestants and Greek Orthodox subjects, and then he did the same for Jews. So here we see the impact of the Peace of Westphalia, in which, by creating room for multiple religions, it also created room for Jews. Now, what did the Edict of Toleration in Joseph II's Edict of Toleration do for Jews? It opened previously closed occupations, such as the guilds. It opened schools to Jews, and it began a form of administrative integration in which Jews would begin to give up control of their own corporation or semi-estate and be under the direct rule of the state itself. In Prussia, in the same year, 1781, 1782, a major public debate began when a journalist and civil servant by the name of Christian Wilhelm von Dohm published a book called On the Civic Amelioration of the Jews, in which he directly addressed this question: can Jews be subjects or citizens of the state? And he answered yes, though with certain conditions. And then, of course, a decade later, the French Revolution created uniform citizenship and equality with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The French Revolutionary Assembly first granted Protestant citizenship, France being a Catholic country, and then in 1790 and 91 granted Jews equal rights as citizens as well.
Wow. So it seems to have been a really complicated process that was a process of 2 steps forward, 1 steps back. In some cases, very grudgingly granted very limited rights over a very long period of time. And this long process of evaluating Jews for citizenship and, were they worthy and what do they have to do in order to prove themselves equal to Germans, meant that some of the best minds of German Jews are occupied with this question. What does it mean to be a Jew? What can be changed about Jewishness to allow the Germans to see them as more German? How does this affect their own understanding or perception of what Judaism was, how it might better fit into this framework, particularly with Protestant conceptions of religion? How could you understand, and I'm now addressing this to Michah, Jewish thinkers, Mendelssohn obviously being one, but not the only one by a long shot, rethinking what Judaism is and what role it should play in the struggle for these new challenges of fitting in. So, Michah.
Okay, great, thank you. So, I mean, we know from, throughout Jewish history, all the way back to the Bible, right, that Jews' conception of Judaism, right, has always been impacted by the way religion is conceived and practiced both by the majority as well as by other minorities, minority religions that Jews live alongside. So in certain periods, right, the goal has been to distinguish Judaism from surrounding religions. So you can think of all the passages in the Bible that tell the Israelites, don't imitate those idolatrous practices, act differently, don't act like your neighbors. But at other times, Jews have sought to connect Judaism with the majority religion, often as a means of gaining greater acceptance, though not necessarily, but very often. So let's take an example of this, right? In the 17th century, in 17th century Venice, Rabbi Simon Luzzatto, right, sought to align Judaism with Catholicism, right, Italy being Catholic. And he there, in this book, identifies 7 ways in which Judaism and Catholicism are similar to each other and differ than Protestantism. And if you're interested afterwards, I can tell you all the ways in which he says Judaism and Catholicism are similar and differ from Protestantism. But in most German lands, Protestantism reigned supreme. And there was often severe tension between Protestants and Catholics, as we've heard, I mean, in the wake of these bloody wars. So in these states, especially in the Protestant-controlled states, German Jewish thinkers tended to align their conceptions of Judaism with Protestantism. And what they would do is they would criticize their enemies for acting like Catholics. But we have to understand kind of what did Protestantism mean for them. And I don't know that it's useful to kind of talk about some kind of abstract notion of Protestantism, which some scholars of religion like doing. I think it's more important to understand how did they conceive what Protestantism was about? So first, it meant emphasizing the centrality of the Bible, right, and Bible translation. And a centerpiece of Luther's Reformation had been his translation of the Bible into the German vernacular. And we see that in the 18th century, German Jews begin producing their own Bible translations, which I mentioned, into High German, beginning with Mendelssohn. And from the period of 1780 until all the way till the Nazis in 1933, German Jews were obsessed with this Bible translation. They produced 15 different translations of at least the entire Pentateuch, in addition to translations of many translations of individual books like the Psalms, especially like the Psalms, Song of Songs, and others. And this was more than even Protestants produced in the same period. And we have to understand that this was despite Jews being 1% of the German population. So the first element in which I think there's this alignment with Protestantism is this emphasis on Bible translation and the Bible as a kind of center of the curriculum. Second, Protestantism was connected with liberty of conscience, right, in their mind. Well, where did this come from? Well, famously, in his 1521 trial at Worms, Luther had told his Catholic inquisitors, and here's a quote, "Unless I am convinced by scripture and plain reason, my conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and I will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. God help me, amen." Amen. So German Maskilim took Protestantism to mean emphasizing the centrality of reason and free individual conscience in religious practice and belief, right? And someone like, again, who we mentioned many times, Mendelssohn says that a practice of a religious ritual out of fear or out of coercion has no religious value. It has no value at all. It has to be done on the basis of free individual conviction. By contrast, they identified Catholicism. Catholicism for them meant tyrannical, coercive, superstitious religion. And so many of these German Maskilim saw Judaism and presented Judaism as expressing a kind of quintessential Protestant concept of religion. Because Judaism, they said, emphasized rational conceptions of God, again, looking back to the medieval Sephardim and the medieval Jewish rationalist tradition. It embraced scientific rather than magical views of the world. And Judaism had this kind of very interesting feature, which is that it aimed to promote a kind of universal literacy, right, especially for men, but not exclusively for men, that involved the individual understanding sacred text for themselves, right? And so this was kind of seen to present this kind of emphasis on individual conscience. And the Maskilim said, and then to do this to its fullest extent, and to take it to its fullest actualization, we need to read the Bible based on rational principles, which involve understanding it grammatically, and also appreciating its literary elements, and eventually also including understanding it historically. By contrast, they criticized the magical conceptions of Judaism, what they saw as magical conceptions of Judaism, mystical Kabbalistic interpretations of the Bible, and the idea that one somehow needed a rabbi to connect to God. That one couldn't do this on oneself. And they saw this especially as characteristic of the incipient Hasidic movement. And so for many of these Maskilim, this represented a kind of Catholic form of religion that was alien to true Judaism.
That's fascinating. It's such a complex tale that we're weaving here, both in terms of the multiple pathways that David is outlining as Jews struggle toward recognition in various parts of Central Europe, and not only Central Europe. And, you know, I hope you could expand a little bit, David, on what you might call the crooked path to emancipation, which you've written and thought so deeply about in that really wonderful and definitive study of yours, in which I think one of the key takeaways is that the road to emancipation was not straightforward. The outcome was by no means a given, and that it was a very long and deliberate process rather than a single event. So I would like you to maybe say something further about that complexity, and then maybe we can turn to Michah and talk about how that complexity is reflected in the multiple ways that Jews denominated Judaism, so to speak, by the late 18th, but certainly the early 19th century as a response, because there were so many different ways. You're putting the Bible at the center of this, but I think it's institutionally even more complex. So David, if you would comment first again about the political process and leave us with a kind of summary overview, and then Michah about the religious process in tandem with that. David first.
Yes, thank you, Elisheva. Yes, you know, I talked about Joseph II's Edict of Toleration, Dome's tract on the civic amelioration of the Jews, and then I finished with the French Revolution, and I think that might have given a false impression that here, all of a sudden, emancipation is an accomplished fact. That, as you say, that was not the case. Even in France, there was backwards motion. Napoleon in 1806 called an assembly of notables, and then a Sanhedrin, and then in 1808 imposed laws which limited the equality of Jews, particularly in Alsace, and for the next decade. And of course, the events in France had a direct impact on the German states. The impulse after Joseph II's Edict of Toleration, the next legislation that came in the German states was a direct result of the French conquest and occupation of German states. The Kingdom of Westphalia, which was ruled by Napoleon's brother, introduced equality for Jews along the Rhine. Then in competition with the French, a number of German states began to introduce legislation of partial emancipation. Baden in 1808, Bavaria in 1809, Prussia in 1812. But we can quickly see how those partial rights given by those states quickly receded. With the fall of Napoleon in 1814 and 1815 in the Congress of Vienna, the status of Jews was returned to the individual states, and the states very quickly either repudiated the emancipation edicts or began to eat away at them and lessen the equality that they had given. And so that situation of partial emancipation would continue into the 1830s and 1840s. The Revolution of 1848, the revolutionaries would grant full emancipation to Jews in the German states, but when the revolution failed, those rights evaporated as well. Jews get full rights in 1870 with the unification of Germany, full rights at the federal level, but the 17 states which remain in existence as part of the empire have their own constitutions, some of which limited the Jews' rights. So then you begin to have a tension between the laws of the empire and the laws of the individual states.
Michah, do you want to comment on the more internal fallout, if you will, or consequences of this very tangled struggle for emancipation by the various states of Europe?
Yeah, so right, I've already kind of mentioned three different, in broad strokes, approaches to Judaism that kind of developed in this process of the 17th, especially the 18th century. One is this kind of Maskilic approach, which seeks to connect Jews and Jewish tradition with enlightened culture and society. Then you have kind of tradition-bound Talmudism, which kind of seeks to preserve the older Ashkenazic model that's more isolated from Christian society, not completely ever, but more isolated. And then you have a whole set of Jews who you really kind of can't consider to be part of a movement or even a kind of unified group. And this is various people who defect from Judaism for all sorts of different reasons. Some convert to Christianity, some do it for convenience, some do it out of conviction. Some Jews just kind of, slowly are just, drifting away, right? And all these things are happening at the same time. And so I think this is deeply connected to, the question of the Jews' place in society and, the hope for what one sees as the future and possibilities for the future. And what is holding Jews back from kind of gaining this fuller acceptance. And often Christians had, and Protestants had criticized Judaism as being insular and as being kind of backward. And to some degree, I think the Maskilim internalized and kind of agreed with some of those criticisms. Not just to, I think, appease the Christians, but because they truly believed that there was a kind of problem within the Jewish community. And so we saw this kind of attack on tradition-bound Talmudism for emphasizing this kind of blind obedience, for isolating Jews from Christians, from adopting what they saw as hateful views of Christians, persecuting Jews who deviated from rabbinic authority, disdaining scientific knowledge in favor of magic and superstitious thinking, fostering a culture where people didn't behave with proper respect for one another and had kind of bad manners. And they saw this also as reflected in houses of worship. And so, I think to many of the Maskilim, a lot of these attacks, they were on target. The rabbis, for many of the traditionalist rabbis, for their part, didn't take this attack lying down, right? And they said, no, the Maskilim are operating often with these kind of vain ideas and vain hopes for acceptance. They, of course, they would, for the most part, welcome advances in Jewish civil rights, but they weren't necessarily so confident that this would be tied to reforming Judaism. And even if it did involve that, they often believe that this was wrong because this was a kind of deviation from the true divine tradition. And they often responded to the Maskilim in very harsh terms, right? They responded that the Maskilim were sycophantic imitators of Christians who lacked Jewish pride and deep attachment to Judaism. They tried to cast a doubt on their motives, to say, well, their real motives are really to advance themselves socially and economically. And it's really not about preserving Jewish tradition. It's really about these very material concerns. And they see them as arrogantly throwing off rabbinic authority and Jewish tradition. And one finds both the Maskilim, many of the Maskilim and traditionalist rabbis criticizing Jews who defect from Judaism, right? So they kind of sometimes are united on that front. But as the dust begins to settle at the end of the 18th century, it becomes clear that this traditional Talmud-centered or tradition-bound Judaism is in steep decline in Germany. And you already find, for instance, in the first few decades of the 19th century, most of the major German yeshivot had closed. And in the 19th century, Haskalah becomes replaced by three Jewish religious denominations: Reform Judaism, what was called Neo-Orthodoxy or Modern Orthodoxy, and Positive Historical Judaism or Conservative Judaism. These emerge by the mid-century, mid-19th century. And each of these groups have bitter disputes with one another. So there's a lot of tension within the Jewish community, even among the kind of inheritors of the Maskilim. And the number of Jews who defect from Judaism in various ways by converting to Christianity, or who declare allegiance to secular ideology like socialism, or simply drift away, only increases in the 19th century. But we should say that while the traditional Talmud-centered Judaism declined in Germany, in Hungary, this counterattack to Haskalah coalesced into a more, I don't know, I would say formal ideology, but more, conservative ideology that became known as ultra-Orthodoxy.
Yeah, so it sounds like I have to adopt the famous dictum that was written by a writer, but should be adopted by historians. The past is not dead. It isn't even past yet. I hear so many resonances of contemporary issues in Jewish life and in the position of Jews in the larger culture in both of your presentations. So I'm wondering, this time let's maybe shift the order and ask you if you wanted to just have a last word about some of the lasting effects of these developments that we've been discussing on contemporary Jewish life, anything at all that you think might be relevant or interesting. Michah, if you would just say a few words.
Just a few words about this. I think that what's happening in this period is that German Jews are beginning to confront a set of really critical problems that remain with us today. Is adherence to Judaism consistent with modern ideals like freedom, tolerance, and universal human rights? Right? Can one affirm commitment to Judaism while at the same time participating in the scientific, cultural, and political life of the state? Or does one at some point just have to really choose between those two? And if one can affirm both commitment to Judaism and participation in modern life, how does this impact how one conceives Judaism, right? And then finally, as it kind of merges in the 19th century with all these kind of traumas and these kind of step backwards, right? We have the question that, comes to be raised, which is, can Jews live safely in a modern Christian nation state, right? So I think you can see that in terms of contemporary resonances, right? We've already said Reform, conservative, modern Orthodoxy, ultra-Orthodoxy. I would also include Zionism and various forms of Jewish secularism are different answers to these questions, right? And they all kind of in some ways emerge out of problems that are beginning to arise in this period.
Well, thank you so much for that.
Just one more. Yeah, sorry.
Sure, please. I'm sorry.
I just also want to kind of pull out the camera a little further, which is to emphasize that these types of questions aren't limited to Jews, right? But in many ways pertain to diverse ways that any ethnic, religious, or racial minority face living in a modern liberal state. And I think two questions that flow out of this in kind of two directions are what does the majority owe to the minority? And what does the minority owe to the majority? So I would say in terms of the tensions we've seen over race, religion, immigration over the past 20 years, I think this is evidence that these questions, which emerge among German Jews in this period, continue to be among the most pressing that are facing us today.
Thank you, Michah. That's a wonderful summation and leaves us with so much to think about. So David, the last word will be yours. And again, to the audience, the Q&A button is on the bottom. Please feel free to use it because after David speaks, we're going to open up the floor.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate some of the things that Michah said very briefly. I think what's important to keep in mind is that the experience of Jews in the German states in the 18th and 19th century really was sort of a seismic event in which the entire landscape of Judaism changed. It's not only the emergence of these new denominations, but even the nature of Orthodox Judaism, which saw itself as the continuing traditional Judaism, also changed. Nothing was unchanged. So that's something I'd like to underscore. And finally, I'd just like to say that in terms of understanding the contemporary world, I think the experience of Muslims in Europe today is actually very similar or recapitulates many characteristics of the experience of Jews in the German states or across Europe in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. The whole question of, you know, for our period, it's can Jews be citizens? Today, it's a question: can Muslims be citizens? What, you know, in the 18th and 19th century, it was what level of Jewish observance is compatible with citizenship and civil society. Today, that's the same question is being raised for Muslims in Europe. So,
well, thank you very much. This was a wonderful conversation, and now David Brown is going to throw us some of the questions, and the speakers can either jump in if you want to take it, or if not, I'll try and assign questions to one or the other.
Yeah, thank you, Elisheva, and thank you, David and Michah, for this fascinating conversation, and thanks to the audience for all your excellent questions. I can already tell we're not going to get to them all, but I'll try and pick out a few that maybe touch on some areas that haven't been covered yet. And Raul Goldschmidt asks a good question that I think you did touch on, but perhaps could elaborate on further. And that he writes, the Maskilim were a small portion of the Jewish communities. How did the more common Jews fare during the Enlightenment? How were they able to deal with the changing circumstances?
Michah, do you want to try that?
Yeah, I'll say a little bit, and then I'll turn it over to David. Right, as I had mentioned, right, the Maskilim were a very, very small group, mostly an urban group. But again, this and for the most part, we kind of have the story of Moses Mendelssohn coming from Dessau, and from this kind of Talmud center, tradition bound community, and then coming into Berlin and experiencing these changes, right? But this was fairly anomalous, but and to a large degree, the communities remained tradition bound. The rabbis in this period kind of begin to respond, to what they see as dangers. They see that what's happening among the Maskilim isn't irrelevant. It isn't just kind of something limited to Berlin, but it's something that poses a threat to Jews in Europe from their perspective, in other countries. So the chief rabbi of Prague, Ezekiel Landau, is responding and attacking the program for educational change that's enacted by one of Mendelssohn's colleagues, Naftali Herz-Vesely. And I think, and as the century goes on and into the 19th century, these patterns have, and this Maskilic approach is having wider and wider influence on Jews, now moving outside the city, also into the rural areas, and is just really spreading. David, if you have anything.
Even though I don't want to spend too much time on one question, I wanted to ask David Sorkin if you want to just comment a little bit, because I think that's where the question was directed, on rural Jewry and maybe some patterns of religious change that did or didn't affect Jews living in the villages and so forth.
I want to speak more to the sociological dimension of the issue. I think what's important to keep in mind is as Jews returned to the German states after the Peace of Westphalia in the 17th and 18th centuries, the vast majority of Jews ended up in rural areas. There had been very few continuous urban settlements of Jews in the German states. Prague was one, Worms was another, Frankfurt a third. But most Jews were living in rural areas, in small communities. whereas, as Michah pointed out, the Haskalah was primarily an urban phenomenon. Those young people who were interested in the Haskalah and what it had to offer flocked to urban centers like Berlin, which was a magnet for the Maskilim, but for Central European intellectuals in general. I think it's important to keep in mind that, as Michah pointed out, the Haskalah then sort of disseminated or diffused out into the rural areas and these smaller settlements. As a matter of fact, when the first rabbinical assemblies are convened in the 1840s, it's been shown that a lot of the representatives who came to that rabbinical assembly wanted to learn about reforms and bring them back to their communities. It's not as if they were already engaged in changes. They came to learn about them in order to bring them back to their communities. So there is, and what I would also say that's important is that those rural communities began to change very quickly, because in the course of the 19th century, there is a quickening process of urbanization. Now, that doesn't mean that Jews are moving to, a metropolis like Berlin. What it does mean is that Jews began to move from rural villages to somewhat larger towns, then to provincial capitals, and then eventually on to the metropolis. But that is taking place in the course of the 19th century. And of course, as Jews moved to those larger villages, larger towns, smaller cities, they begin to encounter the possibility of leading different kinds of lives and also encounter different potential forms of Jewish life.
Yeah, I would just direct the interested reader to Mordechai Breuer's book, Modernity Within Tradition, I think is the title, which focuses to some extent on that rural Jewry and its filial piety through the 19th century. David, other questions?
Yeah, here's a question, I think probably for Michah, from Tanya, and you'll have to forgive me for abridging it somewhat, but she asks, what specifically about the Talmud was deemed unreasonable in the ambit of 18th century German Enlightenment culture? One would think that the Hebrew Bible, with its anthropomorphic imagery and reliance on miracle, would be more susceptible to claims of unreasonableness. Please elaborate.
It's a great question. So yeah, this is actually quite a complex question, because Heinrich Heine, famously called Moses Mendelssohn the Jewish Luther, and he compared Mendelssohn's Bible translation to, and the purpose of that to Luther's Bible translation and his attack on the Catholic hierarchy. And Heine compared the Talmud to the Catholic hierarchy, right? So basically, was saying that Mendelssohn rejected the Talmudic tradition, and this is not true at all, right? Mendelssohn respected rabbinic teachings. He, adhered to Jewish law, which had to be practiced according to its rabbinic interpretation. He has, quite a high regard for some of the midrashim, which he sees as teaching very ethical lessons. In fact, Mendelssohn translates, and not only Mendelssohn, other Maskilim also translate certain tales from the Talmud, which they see as inculcating ethical teachings. And even Solomon Maimon, who's someone who's even much further from, was kind of really moving much further away from Judaism. I wouldn't say Mendelssohn moved away from Judaism, but Maimon was moving away from Judaism. He also has the, writes kind of specimens of rabbinic wisdom and finds kind of wisdom in Talmudic teachings. And when it also comes to Midrash, right, the Maskilim tend to also have a high regard for midrashic interpretation, right? And Mendelssohn and other maskilim see this as a kind of sophisticated literary analysis, right? So what they're really opposed to is, first of all, what they see as a neglect of the Bible. And because in traditional Ashkenazic education, again, for males, you know, it really centered on Talmud study from a young age, and the Bible was studied quite, you know, quite minimally. This is, you know, how it's reported. It was something that, you know, very small children would study because it didn't kind of endow prestige. And what brought prestige was, for males, was this kind of proficiency in Talmudic disputation, right? And what the maskilim are arguing is that what's really important in Judaism is practice, is actually ethical practice, right? And even the rituals, they have to be understood what their ethical import is. And they don't like this emphasis on Talmudic disputation, which they see as a form of scholasticism, a purely kind of theoretical process that one's engaging in. And they also are very disdainful, frankly, of rabbinic attempts to impose authority based on their Talmudic knowledge, which they see as a kind of tyrannical and despotic approach. They say, well, since I know a lot of Talmud, therefore I can tell you what is and what should be and what the Jewish, and that kind of grants me a right to leadership in the Jewish community. And the maskilim are saying, no, you know, what's required for leadership in the Jewish community is, yes, there needs to be a kind of knowledge of Jewish texts, but the Bible is centrally important, but also you need a knowledge of other subjects and a broader education. And there needs to be a kind of ethical orientation to one's Judaism. And one needs to be able to speak the vernacular and well. And so Talmudism actually represents, as I said, a kind of despotism. It's also often associated with superstition. And of course, you know, and the Talmud itself does, you know, you do find kind of magical teachings in the Talmud. It's not that all the stories in the Talmud are, you know, very rational compared to the Bible. You have plenty of discussion of demons and all sorts of things in the Talmud, which the maskilim were not, you know, very enamored with. So the answer could be longer, but I'll stop here.
Great, thank you. So there are a couple questions in the Q&A about the topic of conversion and what role that played for Jews in this period. And Elisheva, I know I think you gave a Leo Baeck memorial lecture about that, among other things. But so maybe you would want to start with that one.
Sure. I'll start, but I hope some of the other panelists might want to jump in as well. It's really interesting. For many centuries, through the Middle Ages, Christians had exerted enormous pressure on the Jews living as a minority in their midst to convert to Christianity with very, very little success, gauged by any measure. You know, yes, there were notable converts, but very few of them. As the early modern period progresses, and especially with the birth of Protestantism, which is presented to Jews as a more rational religion, but also a less ritualized form of Christianity, the hope was, beginning with Martin Luther, that Jews would find that more comfortable to assimilate to, as being a more open and in some way a civil religion, rather than being seen as a purely dogmatic one. Ultimately, German society exerts tremendous pressure. You know, famously, Heinrich Heine, who said it was the ticket to allowing him into German society. He didn't necessarily feel the conviction. And as I think Michah already mentioned, the motives for conversion really range the entire gamut from those who sincerely felt attracted, more attracted by one church or the other than they did to a Judaism which they felt didn't have as much to offer them spiritually. Two pretty pragmatic purposes, entry into universities and to civil service jobs was limited to Christians in many places, and Jews who had reached the limit of what they felt they could achieve as Jews didn't feel that it was such a huge leap anymore to simply move into what they thought of as the mainstream, and conversion becomes, for a brief time in the early decades of the 19th century, the 18 teens and the 1820s, a real phenomenon, sociologically important. Many Jews just leave the fold, many with ambivalent feelings, but ultimately, once they make that break, that rupture becomes permanent in the generations that succeed. So conversion, one could think of as one of the responses along a very wide continuum of responses to the challenges that German society was posing to Jews. Responses that ranged all the way from an ultra-orthodoxy that totally rejected any conscious reshaping of Jewishness to respond to German society, to, again, various forms of modulation of Jewishness and Jewish religion, to conversion, which was the ultimate form of assimilation into German society in the 19th century. So if other panelists might want to comment additionally, that would be great.
I just want to say that, an earlier generation of historians, Heinrich Gretz and Shimon Dubnov, talked about a kind of conversion epidemic among German Jews beginning in the 1780s after Mendelssohn's death and continuing into the 19th century. I think what more recent research has shown is that those conversions were limited to a small sector of the Jewish elite in Berlin, but that also Berlin became a magnet for Jews who wanted to convert. Jews who came from elsewhere in the German states who wanted to convert, whether out of conviction or for career purposes, out of opportunism, would come to Berlin to convert because they knew that it was possible to do that. I think Elisheva's notion of this very broad spectrum of responses is important to keep in mind. And I've always thought that Heinrich Heine's quote about his conversion being an entrance ticket to European culture should be supplemented by what Gabriel Rieser, the advocate of Jewish emancipation, said about conversion. He called it an entrance fee of deceit. He himself was a lawyer with and had he not been Jewish, would have had a promising academic career. He refused to convert for the purposes of his career and became a public advocate of Jewish emancipation, an activist, a militant, and he saw conversion as an entrance fee of deceit.
I would just piggyback on that for 1 second and mention that nobody was subjected to greater and more public pressure to convert than Moses Mendelssohn. Mm-hmm. And he too rejected it quite forcefully, even though in the generation of his children, some of them do convert. So conversion was a tremendous pressure on Jews who were in conversation with German culture at that time.
And it's worth I think it's worth adding that Mendelssohn, though it wasn't diagnosed in these terms at the time, basically had a nervous breakdown in resisting the public pressure to convert of the Lafayette affair.
So that actually makes me want to just indulge in a question of my own, which is, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the difference between the Jewish Enlightenment and the Enlightenment writ large on these questions of sort of religious pluralism and toleration. Because you have someone like Lavater saying, you know, well, if you believe in reason and all this, then you would see reason and, you know, convert. But of course, that's different than the Haskalah trying to carve out, you know, a way of remaining Jewish and participating in the larger society. And I wonder if there's a difference there, or if there are similar strains within the larger Enlightenment.
Well, I'll venture at least a bit of an answer. Michah and Elisheva can supplement what I have to say. I think it's possible to see the Haskalah in comparative terms as a form of religious enlightenment, meaning to say the attempt to use Enlightenment philosophy and Enlightenment ideas to re-articulate religious belief. That's certainly what Mendelssohn was doing, and the Maskilim were doing. And I think you can find similar figures among Protestants and Catholics in Europe who are doing the same thing. So I think who are using Enlightenment ideas to articulate their beliefs in an updated fashion, in the same way that, you know, in the 19th century, Protestants and Catholics will use Kant's philosophy or Hegel's philosophy and try and reconcile their belief with it and use it as a medium for religious belief. The same thing was going on in the 17th and 18th century. And so I think the Mendelssohn and the Maskilim fit into this larger phenomenon of what I've called religious enlightenment.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add also that I think it's important that it's, you know, it's not just that the Maskilim were, let's say, using or trying to bring Judaism kind of up to date or make it kind of consistent with the kind of latest philosophy, but they really saw this as a kind of true fulfillment of religious piety and service of God. And so, you know, as I mentioned earlier, the idea that somehow that, you know, that one could serve God out of fear or, you know, out of coercion, somehow that would have value and that would be, you know, somehow religiously acceptable to them was anathema. They said not only because for a kind of political purpose or some kind of purely philosophical reason, but from a religious perspective, that this is kind of unacceptable and that religion demands that you love everyone. You love not just fellow Jews, but humanity, and you work for the good of humanity. And this, I think it's important to see this as, for them, this was a kind of, you know, deeply spiritual imperative that they saw emerging from these kind of changes in ways of, you know, of political thought, of philosophical thought, of philosophical theology, but they saw this as a way of kind of fulfilling Judaism to its kind of fullest promise, right? To really getting back to what Judaism was truly trying to teach. And, you know, so I think it's important also to, that's the way they conceived it.
Even though I have to say that there is an internal or inward-looking component to Maskilim as a Jewish movement that isn't shared with the broader Enlightenment movement. And those were the changes that the Maskilim hoped to bring about within Jewish society specifically. And even though you can find many strong parallels, for example, the diminution of the role of rabbinic scholarship in terms of who should be the ideal leaders of Jewish communities. That's something that might accord with the anti-clericalism of some parts of European Enlightenment, but it has its own Jewish specificity. Same with the reconfiguration of how marriages are constructed. So the elimination of teenage marriages, which were not as common in European society as they were in Jewish society. And the notion that parents arrange marriages for children, but rather, the idea of romantic love being the foundation of a marriage and so forth. So there are a number of very specific changes to the Jewish curriculum, for example, all of which were mentioned by both of our panelists, especially by Michah. These are specific to Jewish society and the repairs that they wanted to make, rather than being part of the general Enlightenment movement, but taking off from it.
Thanks. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Diane notes the comparison between Moses Mendelssohn and Martin Luther, and asked how the Masculine dealt with Martin Luther's anti-Semitism, or if they did.
I mean, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm not actually familiar with, and maybe I've missed something completely, but where this is addressed. I don't know, David or Elisheva, do you know about this? I mean, but I think, but the one thing I would say is that that's why it's very important that to understand that when they talk about Protestantism, it isn't, they don't feel an allegiance to, very often, it's not necessarily the person of Martin Luther, but it's what Protestantism represents. And so, for instance, you have actually, when you have obviously this tremendous intolerance among Protestants that they experience, that you see, throughout the 18th and 19th century. And what's the kind of Jewish response to that? Well, it's that the Protestants are acting like Catholics. So I think very often it's kind of Protestantism is separated from this historical creed, and it's not, and from the way Protestants are actually living, but it becomes this kind of ideal category. And the actual details of, we'll say that Luther was acting like a Protestant, like a Catholic when, but I haven't seen someone say that explicitly. Sorry, Elisheva.
No, David.
Well, I was just going to say that I think Michah is right that Protestantism isn't seen in terms of Martin Luther, but in terms of its practice at the time in the late 18th and early 19th century. And I think one can say that Protestantism provides sort of a model for the decorum and tone of religious observance. For example, it's right at the end of the period we're talking about in 1808 that a Jew by the name of Joseph Wolff delivers the first sermon in German. And that comes out of a Protestant model. A moralizing sermon was at the center of the Protestant service or Protestant community observance. Similarly, one can see this happening in terms of the architecture of the synagogue. Protestant services were frontal, meaning to say the pastor was on a raised dais and would give the sermon from the front. The synagogue, up until the early modern period, had a reading stand for Torah reading in the middle of the synagogue, and the ark was in the front. In the course of the 19th century, the reading stand moves closer and closer to the front towards the ark, and the two then merge. And that is then where the rabbi stands and gives his sermon. So there's a way in which it's the decorum of Protestantism that's influential. Also, the notion that was very common at the end of the 18th and early 19th century, that the religious service was all about edification, the ideal of Erbauung. And the early Jewish reformers take over that notion of edification and see the sermon as promoting edification and think the entire service should promote edification as well.
I completely agree that in the late 18th and early 19th century period that we're focusing on, Martin Luther was really not the center of what people thought of when they thought of Protestantism. And I don't think that's just true for Jews. I think it's true for Germans too. It was very much about a style of worship and a style of being religious rather than focusing on the founder of Protestantism. However, in the later 19th century, when anti-Semitism resurges in Germany, I do think that Jews in particular, but others as well, do have to reckon with the legacy of Luther, which actually was, ferociously anti-Jewish, and then they do have to come back to that. But that's really at a later stage in the development of the Jewish and German story.
Great, thank you. So we're going a little bit over time, so I'll make the last audience question what should be a short answer, even if the answer isn't easy. And I think it's something that might interest other non-Hebrew speakers. Greg asks, what is the translation of masculine? Or what is the etymology of the term?
Well, it comes from the Hebrew word seichel, which means intelligence or wisdom. Seichel in medieval Jewish philosophy meant the active intelligence. And so that's where the term comes from. The 17th
It comes from the
18th
Bible.
century
It's a
thinkers
biblical
adopt.
term.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Amaskilim yashiru kazohar harakia. I think it's in Daniel.
Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
But, and what's interesting is that it's not a literal translation of enlightenment. That would be neurim, or right, that was something to do with, it doesn't have the root of light in it. So that's kind of interesting. That's why some people have suggested it shouldn't be translated as Jewish Enlightenment.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for this great discussion. The Leo Baeck Institute really appreciates your contribution to this. And I just want to say to our audience, thank you for coming. Thank you for your questions. And if you enjoyed this program, on June 21st, we'll be announcing this very soon. We'll have another program focused on Jewish history in the 19th century, also linked to our shared history project. And for that program, we'll be focusing on Jewish women in the arts. And there are a handful of objects in the shared history project that will be unveiled in the coming months. And we're going to have deal with figures like Fanny Hensel and Adele Bloch-Bauer, and we'll be having the scholars who wrote about them on for a similar but also very different panel discussion. So that'll be June 21st, and I encourage you to check our website, and we'll update you about that as well. We'll also be posting this video on YouTube, so you can watch it again, see the transcript, share it with your friends. So thank you all for coming, and Elisheva, David, Michah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice afternoon.